There are 50,000 American troops sitting in the Middle East right now, and they are not there to go home anytime soon. For months, inside the walls of the Pentagon, a plan has been quietly taking shape, one that has barely been explained to the American public in any real detail. This is not another airstrike plan. Iran has already absorbed strike after strike for nearly a year. This is something else entirely, something that has only surfaced in leaked reports, classified briefings, and a few unguarded comments from officials who said more than they probably intended to. This is a plan for American soldiers to physically set foot on Iranian ground. Here's the detail that should make you pay attention. According to reporting from the Washington Post, the Pentagon has been preparing for what officials described as weeks of ground operations inside Iran, involving both special operations forces and conventional infantry units. Not a single strike package, not a one-night raid, weeks on foot. Inside a nation that has spent decades constructing tunnels, underground bunkers, and mountain strongholds built specifically to make any invading force bleed for every mile it takes. Sit with that phrase for a second. Weeks of ground operations. That is not a smash-and-grab mission. That is something closer to a sustained military presence inside hostile Iranian territory, and it comes loaded with risks far beyond anything American forces have faced at any other point in this war. So why hasn't it happened yet? Why, after everything, the airstrikes, the naval blockade, the death of Iran's own supreme leader, has Washington still not pulled this trigger? Is it because senior commanders understand something about Iran's terrain and its style of resistance that the public has never been told? Or is it because what would unfold the moment American boots touched Iranian soil is far more dangerous than anyone in Washington is willing to say out loud? Retired General Joseph Votel, a man who once commanded the entire United States Central Command overseeing this exact war, said something recently that deserves your full attention. He said the White House does not appear to be considering a ground operation aimed at Iran's nuclear sites, not because the mission is impossible, because of what it would cost to attempt it, and what it would cost if it failed. That is only one voice in a much bigger picture, because right now there are at least 3 very different versions of what a ground invasion of Iran could actually look like, and every single one carries a nightmare scenario that almost nobody outside defense circles is talking about. One version ends with American soldiers paraded as hostages on Iranian state television. Another ends in a drawn-out guerrilla conflict with no clean exit. And the third, the one that worries planners most, involves a trap that Iran appears to have already started building months before a single American boot has crossed that border. By the time this is finished, you will understand what those 3 scenarios actually are, why a real ground invasion could turn out far worse than anything the public has been prepared for, and why the difference between this war ending in weeks or dragging on for years may already be sitting inside a decision nobody in Washington has dared to make yet. To understand how we got here, you have to rewind to the earliest days of this conflict, because the idea of American boots inside Iran did not appear out of nowhere. It has been building quietly since almost the first week of fighting. Back in early March of this year, only days after Israel and the United States launched the surprise strikes that opened this war, Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, publicly accused Washington of secretly planning a ground invasion, even while American officials were still talking publicly about diplomacy. Ghalibaf warned that any American soldier stepping onto Iranian soil would, in his words, be set on fire, and he promised retaliation against any regional nation seen as assisting the effort. At the time, plenty of analysts dismissed that as standard wartime posturing, the kind of language regimes use to project strength to their own people. But around that exact same window, other things were happening that made the accusation harder to brush off. The USS Tripoli arrived in the Middle East, carrying roughly 3,500 sailors and Marines. The commander of United States Central Command sat down with senior Israeli military leadership to discuss curbing Iran's weapons production. And elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, a unit trained specifically for rapid insertion into hostile environments, were also moved into the region. By the end of that same month, the reporting turned considerably more direct. The Washington Post reported that the Pentagon was preparing for what it called weeks of ground operations inside Iran, potentially including raids on Kharg Island and coastal targets near the Strait of Hormuz. That reporting noted the plans stopped short of a full invasion, but still involved special operations troops and conventional infantry, exposing American personnel to genuine danger from Iranian drones, missiles, ground fire, and improvised explosives. Around that same period, separate reporting from Al Jazeera revealed one specific mission under consideration, sending American forces into Iran to physically extract roughly 450 kilograms of enriched uranium material, an operation that would require ground troops to secure a location deep inside hostile territory, hold that ground, and manage some of the most dangerous material on the planet while under fire. At almost the exact same moment these plans were reportedly being drafted, President Trump was telling the public something very different. In early March, he told NBC News that sending ground troops into Iran right now would be, in his own words, a waste of time. He said Iran had already lost its navy and lost everything of value it had to lose, and he dismissed a warning from Iran's foreign minister that a ground invasion would end in disaster for the invaders as, in his words, a wasted comment. Stop and consider that for a moment. The President of the United States was publicly calling a ground invasion pointless at the very same time his own Pentagon, according to multiple independent reports, was actively developing plans for exactly that kind of operation. Whether that gap reflects genuine internal disagreement, deliberate misdirection toward Tehran, or simply a president keeping every option open while downplaying it in public, nobody outside that room can say for certain. But the space between what was said publicly and what was reportedly being planned privately is itself a meaningful part of this story. That gap has never really closed. If anything, it has widened as the months have passed. As recently as mid-July, Al Jazeera reported that Trump had refused to rule out sending troops into Iran as fighting resumed after yet another ceasefire attempt collapsed. And, just last week, Foreign Policy magazine published a detailed piece quoting former military officials directly on where things currently stand. That reporting is worth taking seriously precisely because it avoids sensationalizing in either direction. According to several former officials interviewed, the United States does not appear to be moving toward a large-scale ground operation, one big enough to occupy meaningful Iranian territory, because that kind of mission would demand far more troops than the roughly 50,000 currently stationed across the region. But those same officials said more limited ground operations remain entirely possible, things like targeted special operations raids on specific military sites, or the seizure of a strategically valuable location such as Kharg Island, one of Iran's most important oil export terminals. One quote from that same reporting deserves special attention. A member of Congress, who had been briefed on the administration's thinking, said this about President Trump, quote, "I think he's shielded from bad news, so I certainly think that, in his head, he thinks a ground invasion is a plausible option." That is a genuinely unsettling thing for a sitting lawmaker to say publicly about how a wartime president is being informed. It suggests this debate is not purely a military question. It may also be a question of who is actually shaping the president's picture of the risk and whether the complete picture is even reaching him. Now let's actually break down what those risks look like in practice, because this is where the reporting gets specific, and specific enough to explain why senior military leaders remain so cautious about this option, even after nearly a year of continuous war. The first and most immediate danger is what analysts describe as Iran's doctrine of asymmetric substitution, and once you understand it, the phrase stops sounding abstract very quickly. Iran's military leadership has made clear, through both public threats and confirmed incidents, that it does not need to defeat American forces in open battle to claim a strategic win. Its stated objective instead is to capture American personnel alive. Regime-linked figures have discussed specific plans to launch ground incursions against American bases in Kuwait, including Camp Bering, Camp Arifjan, and Ali al-Salam Air Base, with the explicit goal of taking American soldiers hostage. This is not new or isolated. Reporting shows that as early as March, Iranian officials warned that any American move to seize Kharg Island could be met with helicopter-borne assaults, specifically designed to capture troops rather than simply push them back. And this is not purely rhetorical either. In May, Kuwaiti security forces intercepted an infiltration team linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard attempting to breach Bubiyan Island, a sensitive port zone near the Iraqi frontier. 4 operatives were captured following a firefight that left a Kuwaiti soldier wounded. That is a confirmed, on-the-record event, not speculation, and it shows this kind of operation is something Iran is genuinely willing to attempt. Why would Iran choose hostages over holding ground? Analysts who track this conflict closely explain that capturing even a modest number of American personnel, potentially as few as 100, would immediately internationalize the entire war. It would pull allied governments, international mediators, and possibly the United Nations Security Council directly into hostage negotiations, shifting global attention away from Iran's military setbacks and toward a hostage crisis capable of dominating headlines and pressuring both the American public and Congress. In short, Iran does not need to win a ground war to win the news cycle, and nearly every serious analyst studying this doctrine agrees that hostage-taking, far more than territorial defense, is the single biggest threat facing any American force that crosses into Iran. The second major risk gets far less attention in mainstream coverage, and it comes down to terrain most Americans have simply never had reason to think about. Iran is not a small, flat country. It is one of the most mountainous nations in the entire region, dominated by the Zagros mountain range in the west, a landscape of steep ridgelines, narrow valleys, and natural choke points that has shaped Iranian military thinking for generations. Iran has spent decades, not months, building underground facilities, tunnel networks, and hardened bunkers throughout this exact terrain, engineered specifically to survive sustained bombardment and to give defenders a massive advantage against any force attempting to move through on foot. This is the very same terrain and tunnel philosophy that has made Iran's nuclear sites so hard to fully destroy from the air. Apply that same landscape to a ground invasion scenario, and it becomes something potentially far more dangerous. Terrain where a technologically superior force can still find itself pinned down, ambushed, and worn down slowly in country built almost entirely to favor whoever is defending it. The third risk, and arguably the one senior planners fear most, is what analysts call Iran's doctrine of irregular warfare. It is important to describe this accurately because it gets mischaracterized often. Multiple defense analysts cited directly in recent reporting describe Iran's conventional ground projection capability as genuinely limited. A large-scale conventional invasion of a country like Kuwait is considered by most serious analysts to be, in the words of one recent assessment, inconceivable given Iran's actual military capabilities and the overwhelming American and coalition presence already stationed in the region. But limited conventional strength does not mean limited danger. Iran's entire military doctrine for decades has centered on irregular warfare instead, meaning proxy militias, improvised explosive devices, ambush tactics, and slow attrition rather than direct battlefield confrontation. This is the exact playbook Iran and its regional partners have used successfully for years against much larger, better-equipped opponents. Apply that doctrine to an American ground presence inside Iran itself, and even a so-called limited operation, a raid, a temporary hold on an island, a mission to secure nuclear material could very quickly stop looking limited at all and start resembling the opening phase of a long, grinding irregular fight, with no clear finish line, fought on terrain and against tactics that history has shown are extremely difficult to fully neutralize. Here's where the picture gets even more complicated, because this is not simply a question of whether America could physically execute a ground operation. It is a question of what that operation would actually be trying to achieve, and even the country's most experienced senior officers appear divided on that point. General Vatel's comments matter here because they push directly against the idea that a ground invasion would target Iran's nuclear program at all. He said plainly that the White House does not appear to be considering a ground operation aimed at nuclear sites, and separately stated, in his own words, "I don't think we're looking to put troops in downtown Tehran." That is a former commander of the exact military apparatus running this war telling the public, in plain language, that a full-scale invasion aimed at regime change or seizing nuclear facilities does not appear to be on the table right now. But that raises an obvious question. If a full invasion is not the plan, what exactly are these limited ground operations reportedly being built for? Based on available reporting, the answer centers on a small handful of specific objectives, none of which amount to occupying the country outright, though everyone still carries serious risk. The first is a possible seizure of Kharg Island, Iran's most important oil export terminal, a move that would let Washington apply direct economic pressure without needing to hold significant mainland territory. The second is the possibility of special operations raids targeting specific military sites, quick and precise missions using elite forces rather than large infantry units, meant to disable a capability and then withdraw immediately. And the third, based on earlier reporting from March, is the far more delicate scenario of a mission to physically secure or extract Iran's remaining enriched uranium stockpile, an operation that would require American forces to locate, access, and control fissile material inside hostile territory, with almost zero margin for error and enormous consequences if anything went wrong. Each of these scenarios is meaningfully different from a full-scale invasion in the traditional sense, the kind of operation that toppled governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. But every one of them still requires American troops to physically enter and operate inside a country that, by its own stated doctrine, is prepared to answer with hostage-taking, ambush tactics, and irregular warfare rather than a conventional defense. That is precisely why so many analysts describe this current moment as more dangerous, not less, than an all-out invasion would be. A massive, overwhelming invasion at least brings the full weight of American air power, armor, and numerical superiority to bear all at once. A limited operation, by contrast, puts a smaller number of American troops into direct contact with an adversary whose entire strategy is built around exploiting exactly that vulnerability, drawing the fight out, and turning isolated incidents into massive strategic and political victories. Iran's recent behavior outside its own borders makes this concern anything but hypothetical. In the days just before this reporting, Iran launched drone and missile attacks on both Kuwait and Bahrain, two nations hosting some of the largest concentrations of American forces anywhere in the region. Following those attacks, Iranian officials explicitly threatened further ground offensives against American bases and regional states if Washington moved to strike Iranian territory directly, with some regime-linked figures again raising the specific idea of capturing American soldiers. Analysts who study Iran's actual military capabilities remain genuinely doubtful that Iran could pull off anything resembling a large-scale conventional ground offensive of its own, pointing to the same structural weaknesses already discussed, limited conventional projection capability, an overwhelming coalition presence, and Iran's own long-standing preference for irregular tactics over direct confrontation. But skepticism about a large-scale Iranian offensive is a very different thing from confidence that isolated infiltration attempts or hostage-seeking raids could not succeed. The Bubiyan Island incident in May already proved Iran is willing to attempt exactly this kind of operation, even against a smaller and less heavily defended target than a direct American base. So where does all of this actually leave things right now, at the end of July, with 50,000 American troops still positioned across the region, and Pentagon planning documents reportedly built around scenarios that fall just short of full invasion? The honest answer, based on everything currently verifiable, is that the United States appears to be deliberately steering away from the single most catastrophic option: a full-scale occupation aimed at regime change, or total nuclear disarmament campaign fought street by street across Iranian territory. Multiple former officials, including a former commander of United States Central Command, have said as much directly and on the record. But that same reporting makes clear that smaller, far more targeted ground operations remain very much on the table, and those operations, despite their limited scope, carry real and serious risks that have nothing to do with the size of the force involved and everything to do with the kind of war Iran has spent decades preparing to fight. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. This conflict has already shown over and over that predicting Iran's next move with any real confidence is genuinely difficult, and predicting how fast a limited operation could spiral into something far larger is even harder. A single successful hostage-taking incident, a single ambush resulting in American casualties, a single miscalculation during an island seizure or a raid on a fortified position, any one of these could shift the political calculus in Washington overnight, turning a carefully limited operation into pressure for the kind of full-scale response officials currently insist is not on the table. Wars rarely unfold exactly the way initial plans describe, and a conflict already defined by broken ceasefires, unconfirmed strikes, and competing public statements from officials on every side is exactly the kind of environment where a limited operation could turn into something far bigger, far faster than anyone currently expects. Here is what can be said with confidence based on everything currently on the record. The Pentagon has, according to multiple independent reports spanning several months, developed plans for ground operations inside Iran that go well beyond anything carried out publicly so far. Senior military voices, including a former head of United States Central Command, have directly pushed back on the idea that a full invasion targeting nuclear sites or regime change is currently being pursued. But limited operations, potentially including the seizure of strategic territory like Kharg Island, targeted special operations raids, or an extremely high-risk mission to secure Iran's remaining nuclear material, remain very much alive as possibilities. And Iran, for its part, has made clear through both rhetoric and at least one confirmed infiltration attempt that its likely response to any American ground presence will prioritize capturing personnel and dragging out a prolonged, irregular fight. Rather than attempting to meet American forces in a conventional confrontation, it has no realistic chance of winning. That is the actual picture right now, stripped of exaggeration in either direction. Not a full-scale invasion already underway, whatever some corners of the internet might claim, but also not a scenario where the danger has passed, or where the risk of American ground forces entering Iranian territory has meaningfully shrunk. It remains a live, unresolved question sitting quietly behind nearly a year of airstrikes and diplomacy, waiting on a decision that could still go in several very different directions in the weeks ahead. Whatever happens next, one thing is already clear from everything currently on the record. If American troops eventually do cross into Iranian territory, in any capacity, the risks involved will not resemble the ones the public has been trained to expect from this war so far. This will no longer be a story about airstrikes and satellite footage. It will be a story about mountainous terrain built for ambush, a regime doctrine explicitly designed around hostage-taking rather than battlefield victory, and a country that has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, long before the first bomb ever fell in this current conflict. We will keep following every verified development in this story as it unfolds, because a question this serious deserves nothing less than careful, fact-based reporting. And if that is the kind of coverage you value, consider staying subscribed, because the next chapter of this war may turn out to be the one nobody saw coming.